Beloved hearts, as the evening settles and the noise of the day grows quiet, we turn our hearts toward the Lord who listens when we call. Psalm 4 teaches us that rest is not found in silence alone, but in trust. The psalmist cries out with confidence, knowing that God has made room in times of distress and has never withdrawn his mercy. This is the prayer of a soul that has learned where true safety dwells, not in circumstances, not in human assurance, but in the steady presence of the righteous one who hears his children. In this prayer of covering, we lay down anxious thoughts and restless questions. We remember that the Lord sets apart the faithful for himself, and that our cries do not fall into emptiness. When confusion presses upon the mind and fear seeks to linger in the heart, the psalm gently calls us back to be still, to search our hearts, and to trust. Even in the dark, God's light is not absent. His peace guards the inner life more surely than walls guard a city. So we lie down and sleep, not because all problems are solved, but because the Lord alone makes us dwell in safety. This is quiet rest, not the escape of weariness, but the calm of faith. Covered by his presence, our thoughts are steadied, our hearts are kept, and our souls learn again the holy rhythm of trust. In this confidence, night becomes a place of peace, and rest becomes an act of worship. When the heart is troubled and the mind refuses to be still, the first truth Psalm 4 gently presses upon the soul is this: God's presence is not distant, delayed, or uncertain. It is near, attentive, and active, even when we feel overwhelmed by anxious thoughts. The psalm opens with a cry that is both urgent and confident, a prayer that rises from distress, yet rests on memory. The one who prays remembers that God has answered before, that he has made space where there was pressure and light where there was confusion. This remembrance itself becomes a covering for the anxious heart, because anxiety thrives where God's nearness is forgotten, and peace grows where his faithfulness is recalled. An anxious heart often believes it must carry everything alone. It rehearses fears in silence and multiplies questions in the dark. Yet Psalm 4 interrupts this pattern by turning anxiety into prayer. The psalmist does not suppress his distress, nor does he dress it in false strength. He speaks plainly, calling upon the God of righteousness, trusting that the same God who once delivered will listen again. This turning of the heart toward God is itself an act of covering. It draws the mind away from spiraling thoughts and places it under the care of one who sees the whole path, not just the present moment. There is something deeply healing in knowing that God hears, not merely that he is capable of hearing, but that he chooses to listen with mercy. Anxiety often whispers that our prayers are burdensome, repetitive, or unnoticed. Psalm 4 answers this lie with quiet authority. The Lord has set apart the faithful for himself. This means the anxious heart is not an inconvenience to God, it is an object of his covenant care. To be set apart is to be known, guarded, and valued. When this truth settles into the soul, fear begins to loosen its grip, because the heart realizes it is not abandoned to chance or chaos. The presence of God does not always remove the source of anxiety immediately, but it changes the atmosphere within the heart. Like a gentle light in a dark room, his nearness does not argue with fear, it outshines it. The psalmist acknowledges that many around him seek empty assurances and fleeting comforts, yet he turns away from these voices. Anxiety often grows louder when we listen too closely to the noise around us, opinions, pressures, comparisons, and expectations. Psalm 4 invites the heart to step back from that noise and rest in a quieter truth. God's favor is better than any external security. In this prayer we see that anxious thoughts are not silenced by force, but calmed by truth. The psalm calls us to tremble and not sin, to search our hearts upon our beds, and to be still. This is not a command to suppress emotion, but an invitation to bring emotion under God's presence. The anxious heart is often restless because it is searching for certainty where none can be found. God's presence becomes a covering by redirecting that search toward Him, who remains steady when everything else shifts. There is a sacred stillness that comes when the heart realizes it is seen by God. Not judged harshly, not dismissed, but seen with compassion. Psalm 4 teaches us that God's presence does not merely observe our anxiety from a distance, it enters into our inner life. He makes room in distress, meaning He does not demand that we resolve our fears before approaching Him. Instead, He creates space within the heart where peace can grow alongside unanswered questions. The anxious heart often lives in the future, anticipating harm, loss, or disappointment. God's presence gently draws the heart back to the present moment, where His grace is sufficient. In prayer, the heart learns to breathe again, to slow down, to listen. This is not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet one. Like a child calmed by the nearness of a parent, the soul settles not because every fear is explained, but because it is no longer alone. Psalm 4 also reveals that anxiety is often connected to misplaced trust. The psalmist contrasts those who chase false good with those who receive joy from God's countenance. Anxiety feeds on instability, and false goods always fail to satisfy. God's presence becomes a covering because it reorders desire. The heart begins to seek God's light rather than human approval, divine peace rather than worldly reassurance. This shift does not happen instantly, but it begins in prayer, where the heart learns to name what truly matters. As the prayer unfolds, the psalmist speaks of joy placed in the heart by God, greater than abundance or prosperity. This joy is not loud or exuberant, it is deep and steady. It coexists with uncertainty, yet is not ruled by it. For the anxious heart, this joy acts like an anchor. It holds the soul steady when waves of worry rise. It reminds the heart that peace is not dependent on outcomes, but on relationship. God's presence also covers the anxious heart by restoring perspective. Anxiety narrows vision, making every problem seem larger and every hope seem smaller. In God's presence, the heart remembers who God is, righteous, attentive, faithful, and who it is in relation to Him, heard, chosen, protected. This remembrance does not erase struggle, but it places it within a larger story, one guided by divine wisdom rather than human fear. Nighttime often intensifies anxiety. When distractions fade, thoughts grow louder. Psalm 4 speaks directly into this vulnerable space, encouraging reflection and trust upon the bed. God's presence becomes especially precious in the quiet hours when the heart is most exposed. The psalm does not offer techniques to silence the mind, it offers a person to trust. In that trust, the heart learns that rest is possible even when answers are incomplete. The covering of God's presence is not something the heart earns through perfect faith or flawless obedience. It is given freely to those who call upon Him. This is why the psalmist prays with confidence, not because he is strong, but because God is faithful. Anxiety often convinces us that we must fix ourselves before approaching God. Psalm 4 gently corrects this, showing that prayer itself is the place where healing begins. As the heart remains in God's presence, anxious, thoughts lose their urgency. They may still arise, but they no longer command the same authority. The soul learns to place them before God rather than carry them alone. This act of surrender is not passive resignation, it is active trust. It is the heart saying again and again that God is sufficient even when circumstances are not. In this way, God's presence becomes a living covering, protective, calming, and sustaining. It does not shield the heart from all pain, but it guards it from despair. It does not eliminate every fear, but it prevents fear from ruling. The anxious heart held within this presence, slowly learns a new rhythm: prayer instead of panic, trust instead of turmoil, stillness instead of striving. Psalm 4 leaves us with the image of a heart that can finally rest, not because the world has grown safer, but because God has drawn near. This is the quiet miracle of divine presence. It transforms anxiety not by denying its reality, but by surrounding it with truth, mercy, and peace. Under this covering, the heart is no longer alone in the dark. It is held, heard, and kept by the one who never sleeps. Quiet rest, as Psalm 4 reveals, is not the reward for a life free of trouble, nor is it the result of careful planning or emotional control. It is an act of trust, deliberate and sacred, offered to God in the very presence of uncertainty. The psalmist does not wait for calm circumstances before resting. He rests because he entrusts himself to the Lord. This distinction is essential because many hearts delay rest until fear subsides, yet fear often subsides only when rest is embraced in faith. Psalm 4 teaches that true rest begins not when problems are solved, but when trust is rightly placed. Trust, in this sense, is not mere agreement with an idea about God. It is the yielding of the inner life to Him. The psalm moves gently from prayer to stillness, from distress to peace, showing us that rest is an expression of confidence in God's character. To lie down in peace is to say without words that God remains in control while we sleep. It is a quiet confession that we do not hold the world together and that we are not required to. This surrender is difficult for the anxious heart, which often believes vigilance is a form of responsibility. Psalm 4 corrects this belief by revealing that vigilance without trust only deepens unrest, while trust invites peace. Rest as trust requires letting go of false supports. The psalmist speaks to those who seek empty answers and fleeting assurances, reminding the soul that such pursuits cannot sustain the heart. When we depend on our own understanding, our own strength, or the approval of others, rest becomes fragile. It breaks easily under pressure. But when trust is placed in God alone, rest gains a deeper foundation. It becomes resilient, capable of remaining even when external stability is absent. The act of lying down is simple, yet spiritually profound. It symbolizes the willingness to release control. Each night, the body gives testimony to the truth that we are creatures, not creators of time. Sleep requires trust because it renders us vulnerable. In sleep, we cannot defend ourselves, solve problems, or manage outcomes. Psalm 4 embraces this vulnerability and transforms it into worship. The psalmist lies down not in fear but in confidence, because he knows who watches over him. The Lord alone makes him dwell in safety. This alone is important. It excludes all other sources of ultimate security and centers rest firmly in God. Calm thoughts do not come from ignoring reality, but from placing reality into God's hands. Psalm 4 does not deny distress, it acknowledges it openly, yet it refuses to let distress have the final word. Trust shifts the focus of the mind. Instead of rehearsing threats, the mind begins to recall truth. Instead of imagining worst outcomes, it remembers God's past faithfulness. This mental turning is not forced optimism, it is practiced trust. Over time, it reshapes the inner landscape, making calm more familiar than fear. The psalmist invites the heart to be still and reflect, especially in the quiet of the night. This stillness is not emptiness but attentiveness. It is a listening posture, open to God's presence. In such stillness, restless thoughts begin to lose momentum. They no longer race unchecked because they are brought into the light of God's nearness. Trust does not silence the mind instantly, but it gives the mind a place to rest. It offers a center of gravity stronger than anxiety. Trusting God for rest also means believing that He is active even when we are not. Anxiety often assumes that if we stop worrying, something will go wrong. Psalm 4 counters this assumption by affirming that God's care does not depend on our wakefulness. The Lord, who hears prayer by day, continues His work by night. To sleep in peace is to acknowledge this truth. It is to say that God's watchfulness surpasses our own, and that His purposes do not falter when we close our eyes. The joy mentioned in the psalm further deepens this understanding of rest. This joy is not tied to circumstances. It is placed in the heart by God. It coexists with trust and grows in the soil of surrender. When the heart trusts God, it becomes receptive to this quiet joy. The joy does not eliminate concern, but it balances it. It gives the heart something solid to hold on to when thoughts begin to wander. In this way, joy supports rest, and rest strengthens trust. There is also a moral dimension to this rest. The psalm encourages the heart to turn away from sin and falsehood, suggesting that unrest is often linked to divided loyalty. When the heart seeks peace while clinging to fear, or seeks rest while refusing trust, tension arises. Trusting God alone brings alignment. It simplifies the inner life. The heart no longer pulls itself in opposing directions. This inner harmony contributes to calm thoughts, making rest not just possible, but natural. Trust grows through remembrance. The psalmist recalls past deliverance as a foundation for present peace. This remembrance is not nostalgia, it is testimony. It reminds the heart that God has acted before and will act again. When trust is rooted in memory, rest becomes more secure. The heart learns that God's faithfulness is not theoretical, but experienced. Each remembered act of mercy becomes a reason to release anxiety and embrace peace. Resting in God also reshapes how the heart views time. Anxiety often compresses time, making the future feel urgent and overwhelming. Trust expands time, placing it within God's eternal care. The night becomes a gift rather than a threat. Sleep becomes renewal rather than escape. In trusting rest, the heart allows itself to pause, confident that tomorrow is held by the same God who holds today. Psalm 4's vision of rest is deeply relational. It is not the rest of isolation, but of companionship with God. The psalmist does not retreat into himself, he rests in the presence of the Lord. This relational trust brings warmth to the idea of rest. It is not cold resignation, but loving confidence. The heart rests because it knows it is known, loved, and protected. As trust deepens, calm thoughts follow. The mind begins to reflect the heart's confidence. Thoughts become less reactive and more reflective. They move more slowly, shaped by prayer rather than panic. This does not mean the absence of troubling thoughts, but the presence of a greater truth that governs them. Trust becomes the lens through which thoughts are interpreted, and calm emerges naturally from this perspective. The final movement of the psalm brings us to the simple yet profound statement of safety. The psalmist lies down and sleeps in peace, not because he has secured his environment, but because the Lord has secured him. This is the heart of restful trust. It acknowledges dependence without fear. It accepts limitation without despair. It finds peace not in control but in care. In a world that often equates rest with escape or indulgence, Psalm 4 presents rest as faith. It is the faith that releases the heart from constant striving. It is the faith that allows the mind to quiet without guilt. It is the faith that believes God remains good and present even in the silence of the night. Such rest is not weakness, it is strength rooted in humility. Trusting God alone for rest reshapes the entire rhythm of life. It teaches the heart when to act and when to release. It nurtures calm thoughts not by denying difficulty, but by placing difficulty within God's care. Over time, this trust becomes habitual. Rest becomes less of a struggle and more of a response. The heart learns that peace is not something to chase, but something to receive. Psalm 4 leaves us with an image of a soul at peace in the dark, not because the dark has vanished, but because God is present within it. This is the gift of trusting rest. It transforms the night into a sanctuary, the bed into a place of prayer, and sleep into an offering of faith. In trusting God alone, the heart finds that calm thoughts are not forced into existence. They arise naturally from the deep assurance that the Lord watches over his own.